The forest was alive one moment and shattered the next as chainsaws tore through the air like steel fangs. Edward said, "They cut without mercy, and the trees groaned as though they had souls." The sound drowned out birds, silencing a symphony that had sung for centuries. Fallen trunks hit the ground like thunder, shaking soil where roots had bound generations together. Clara said, "Each collapse feels like a heartbeat stopping." A fox darted from the brush, fur blazing red, eyes wide with fear, as a storm of dust swallowed daylight. The air thickened with ash before flames licked the bark, and smoke twisted upward like a funeral banner. Matthew said, "The forest was our cathedral, and they are burning it for profit." Leaves scattered like torn scripture, drifting into blackened soil. Shadows stretched unnaturally as the canopy vanished, exposing fragile creatures to the open sky. In the chaos, silence fell harder than sound, a silence where life once thrived. The silence that followed was worse than the chaos, pressing down with unbearable weight. Edward said, when the trees fell, their silence screamed louder than their cries. Animals had scattered, but the absence of birdsong was the sharpest wound. Forest floor smelled of damp earth laced with burning resin, a scent of endings. Clara said, "It feels like standing in a graveyard of giants." She knelt by a stump, fingers brushing over the raw rings like pages of history carved open. Matthew said, "Every ring is a century, and they cut through time as if it meant nothing." Dust hung heavy in the air, glowing faintly in pale shafts of sun, each particle drifting like ash from a forgotten fire. Shadows stretched long and cruel across the land, revealing a void where canopy once lived. No cry, no rustle, just emptiness, as if the world itself held its breath. The echoes of destruction lingered, carried by wind that no longer met resistance in branches. Clara said, "Without the trees, even the wind sounds lonely." The fox reappeared, sniffing among broken branches, searching for cover that no longer existed. Edward said, "Even the smallest creatures are stripped of sanctuary." The ground was torn open, roots exposed like veins ripped from the earth. Sunlight, harsh and unfiltered, pierced the clearing, flooding spaces once sheltered in green. Matthew said, "The forest is naked, its secrets laid bare." Ash coated everything, leaves, soil, even Clara's fingertips, turning green to gray. The silence cracked briefly with a distant crow, its caw sharp and grieving, then faded. Shadows grew restless as smoke thickened, making the air heavier, harder to breathe. Every breath tasted of endings, as if even oxygen betrayed life. Edward stepped forward, boots crunching over splintered branches, each step echoing louder in the stillness. Edward said, "This ground remembers more than we ever will." He lifted a fragment of bark, its charred edges brittle beneath his fingers. Clara said, "It is like holding the corpse of memory." The fox lingered nearby, eyes glowing amber, waiting for a chance to flee again. Matthew said, "The forest raised us, and we are watching it die." Wind stirred suddenly, lifting ash into swirls that stung their eyes. The clearing seemed larger now, unnatural, as though space itself had been stolen. Every broken trunk was a monument to greed, every splinter a scar. The air pressed tighter, heavy with heat, whispering of flames yet to come. The silence felt alive, breathing alongside them, but it was a hollow breath, carrying sorrow instead of song. The first ember drifted from unseen sparks, glowing like a star before fading into dust. Clara said, "It begins with a single ember, and soon the world follows." Smoke thickened, crawling low, blinding the horizon. Edward said, "The air itself betrays us now." Flames licked at the edges of fallen logs, small tongues of fire testing strength, whispering of infernos to come. Matthew said, "This place will not return in our lifetime." The fox cried out, a sound sharp with panic, before vanishing into the veil of smoke. Clara pressed her hands together, trembling, though no prayer could stop the blaze. The forest that once stood eternal now lay fragile, dying not with dignity but with screams of silence. And above them, the sky turned black, swallowing the last traces of dawn, leaving them in a day that felt already night. The fire smoldered into silence, leaving behind blackened stumps like gravestones marking the fallen. Clara said, "This place feels hollow, like the heart has been torn out of the earth." Edward placed his hand against a surviving tree, bark warm from the lingering heat. He whispered, "You are the last witness of what once was." A deer stumbled from the smoke, trembling, its eyes wide with confusion, its breath steaming in the cool morning air. Matthew said, "Even the innocent creatures are displaced, their homes stripped away overnight." The clearing no longer felt alive, but abandoned, carrying echoes of countless lives, silenced. Clara brushed ash from her face, her hands trembling as though she held the weight of centuries. She said, "This forest trusted us, and we betrayed it." The words lingered in the still air, more cutting than the chainsaws themselves. A fallen log smoldered quietly, releasing faint smoke that twisted like ghosts into the pale sky. Edward said, "This forest was more than wood, it was a family older than memory." He looked to Matthew, whose weathered face sagged with exhaustion. Matthew said, "Every breath we take is a gift from them, and now the gift is stolen." Clara knelt near a sapling miraculously untouched, its leaves trembling with fragile green. She whispered, "You are small, but you carry everything that is left." The sapling became a fragile symbol in the wasteland, fragile but alive, a reminder that life resists even in ruins. The silence returned, heavy, but within it a thread of hope wove itself faintly, waiting to be held. The fox returned, cautious, its fur streaked with soot padding softly across scorched ground. Clara said, "Even the smallest hearts fight to endure." The animal sniffed at a fallen trunk, then darted back into the shadows, leaving only paw prints in the gray soil. Edward lowered himself to sit on a blackened root, staring at the hollow horizon. He said, "I feel smaller here now, like I am trespassing where I once belonged." Matthew rested his hand on Edward's shoulder, the gesture carrying more weight than words. He said, "We are not separate from this loss, we are part of it." The air carried the faint crackle of hidden embers, warning that destruction was not finished. Clara drew a deep breath, ash clouding her lungs, and whispered, "We have to remember them, or else they die twice." The clearing stretched endlessly, each stump carved like a wound that refused to heal. Clara said, "These scars will outlive us." Edward pressed his palm into the soil, feeling the warmth of dying embers beneath. He said, "The earth still burns from the inside." Matthew looked up to the sky, where smoke spread thin against pale clouds, staining them gray. He said, "The sky carries their ashes, scattering them farther than we can imagine." A crow landed on a broken trunk, wings folding with solemn grace. Its caw cracked the silence, sharp and lonely, like a prayer unanswered. Clara closed her eyes, letting the sound sink into her chest. She whispered, "The forest speaks through what remains." The words carried on the cold wind, thin but unyielding. Night approached, shadows spilling across the ruins like a tide. Edward said, "Darkness will not hide the truth of this loss." Clara leaned against a stump, her body weary, her eyes reflecting fading light. She said, "The night feels colder without the trees to hold it back." Matthew crouched near the sapling, its leaves trembling against the evening breeze. He said, "This little one carries more weight than we ever will." In the distance the fox's cry pierced the twilight, haunting and sharp, echoing like a broken hymn. The stars began to appear faintly, their light fragile against the smoke's veil. Clara said, "Even the sky struggles to shine through what we've done." The silence closed in once more, heavy with grief, but not yet surrendered. Wind gathered like a warning, dragging ash across the clearing in grinding waves. Clara said, "The ground feels restless, like it wants to throw us off." Edward scanned the tree line, hearing distant engines throb beneath the breeze. He said, "They are coming back to finish what they began." The fox limped from the brush, favoring one paw, nose to the dead soil. Matthew said, "Hunger will push everything closer to danger." A gust peeled smoke off the stumps and hurled it at the open sky. The sapling quivered, thin leaves shivering like a frightened pulse. Clara said, "We have to shield that life, or we become the silence." The wind rose again, colder, carrying metal and oil, and the rumor of teeth. The forest answered with a low, exhausted creak, as if bracing for the next cut. The engines grew teeth and bit into the clearing with a brutal snarl. Edward said, "Bulldozers at 2 o'clock, keep low." Machines rolled in with yellow armor and black breath, carving ruts into the wounded soil. Clara said, "They are boiling the bones of the earth." A man in a hard hat surveyed the wreck with cold precision. Edward said, "That must be Briggs, the crew lead." Matthew stepped forward, palms raised, voice steady against the storm of noise. He said, "Turn them back, or the fire will own us all." The dozers paused like predators scenting blood, then nudged forward again. The fox vanished into a ditch, tail a flicker of panic. Clara said, "If they push farther, the sapling dies here." The engines answered with iron certainty. A sudden crack split the clearing as a weakened trunk surrendered and crashed across their path. Clara said, "Down." She stumbled, pinned by a lattice of branches, breath snagging on panic. Edward lunged, wedging his shoulder beneath the bark, veins standing like cords. He said, "Breathe and pull to me." The branches groaned, then shifted an inch toward light. Matthew said on 3, and the 3 became one motion against the weight of ruin. The trunk rolled, freeing Clara to scrape forward on her elbows. She said, "The forest keeps falling even after the cut." Above them, smoke dragged the sun into a dim coin. The engines coughed nearer, indifferent and hungry, like weather with orders. The wind swung west and carried embers in a glittering swarm across the stumps. Clara said, "Spot fires moving fast." The first lick of orange found a dry nest of needles and bloomed like a cruel flower. Edward stamped the edge and dragged a blanket over the sparks. He said, "Hold the line around the sapling." Matthew staggered, coughing, then steadied himself with stubborn calm. He said, "I have the north side." The ember storm thickened, turning the air to burning snow. Clara said, "If the machines roll now, the whole basin lights." A siren wailed from the road, distant and useless. The fox barked once from the dark, a small alarm swallowed by the wind. Briggs waved his crew forward, and metal solved every doubt with force. Edward said, "They will shear the root web, and the hill will slide." The dozer clanked toward the sapling, blade low and certain. Clara stepped before it, spine straight, eyes bright with fear and resolve. She said, "You move, and this valley burns from your hand." The operator hesitated, engine idling like a trapped animal. Matthew limped to her side, jaw set against the cough that shook him. He said, "Back up or answer for the ash." Wind shoved smoke between them, drawing a quick gray curtain. The dozer revved and inched, daring them to flinch. The hill groaned, soil cracking like old ice, and the saplings shivered on the edge of ruin. The hill trembled, not from engines but from within, as water surged unseen beneath the roots. Edward said, "It isn't the machines alone, the land is breaking itself." A crack split the soil, revealing a hidden stream long buried by forest floor. Clara gasped. The forest carried water inside its veins. The stream burst forth, carrying ash and embers in a gray torrent. Matthew steadied himself against a stump, eyes widening with sudden clarity. He said, "The trees weren't only shelter, they were the dam holding this place together." Briggs lowered his clipboard, stunned as water raced toward the machines. The fox yelped and leapt away, vanishing into higher ground. Clara said, "It was never just wood, it was a shield, and we shattered it." The hidden truth ran wild in the open, unstoppable. The water carved paths where roots once bound the soil, dragging blackened bark downstream like corpses. Clara said, "This river carries the bones of giants." Edward waded in to steady the sapling as its fragile roots quivered in the rushing current. He said, "Hold, little one, hold." Matthew coughed hard but forced strength into his voice. He said, "We are fighting more than machines. We are fighting collapse itself." Briggs barked orders to his crew, yet his voice cracked beneath the roar of water. The machines reversed clumsily, engines groaning, wheels sinking into mud. Clara reached for Edward's arm, steadying his stance. She said, "We can't save everything, but this piece must survive." The torrent surged, rewriting the land story in real time. The fox reappeared on higher ground, but not alone. A pair of kits stumbled behind, thin and trembling. Clara whispered. She wasn't running from us. She was protecting them. Edward's breath caught as he watched the mother press her body around her young. He said, "She's fighting the same war, just smaller." Matthew lowered his voice, reverent in tone. He said, "Even prey has its own truth, not weakness but endurance." The kits cried softly, ears flicking as they clung to her warmth. The mother's eyes glowed in the fading light, a mirror of Clara's resolve. Clara said, "Every fight is the same fight, survival against the storm." The revelation struck harder than flame or blade. Forest was not dead. It was trying to endure in hidden ways. The machines stalled against mud, their power stripped by nature itself. Briggs shouted in frustration, slamming his fist against steel. Edward said, "Do you see now? You can't conquer what you don't understand." Briggs glared back, but his certainty faltered in the flood's roar. Clara said, "You cut the trees, but you woke the river." Matthew stepped forward, voice low but commanding. He said, "Walk away before this land buries you under your own greed." The crew hesitated, glancing at the rising water, doubt gnawing through their obedience. A silence opened, broken only by the crash of shifting logs. Clara's words floated above the chaos. She said, "The forest was never yours to take, it only tolerated you." The water slowed, pooling into a new marsh where forest once breathed. Clara said, "The land is rewriting itself." The sapling stood bent but alive, roots gripping tighter with each passing minute. Edward said, "It refuses to die, even when drowned." Matthew rested heavily against a stump, sweat and ash marking his skin like war paint. He said, "The truth isn't just that we destroyed. It's that survival still fights in the cracks." Briggs lowered his hard hat, gaze fixed on the sapling as if seeing it for the first time. Clara's voice trembled but carried weight. She said, "Hope isn't in what we cut, it's in what refuses to fall." The revelation was not mercy but a demand, to guard what endured. Night fell fast. The sky choked with smoke and the ground trembling under strain. Edward said, "The ridge is giving way. Move now." The hillside cracked, soil sliding into the flood below with a thunder like cannon fire. Clara grabbed the sapling, her body shielding it as the current surged higher. She said, "I won't let it drown." The fox barked sharply. Her kits huddled at her side, eyes glowing in the dark. Matthew stumbled, coughing hard, but steadied himself with raw defiance. He said, "If this is the fight, then we fight standing." Briggs barked orders, though fear edged his voice now. The machines roared to life again, steel claws biting earth, trying to outpace the collapse. Forest's last stand had become a war of soil, water, and fire. The machines clattered forward, blades sparking against stone as they clawed through ruin. Edward said, "They'll bring the whole ridge down." Clara's voice broke as she shouted, "Stop before nothing is left." Briggs' crew hesitated, fear visible in their shifting eyes. Matthew stepped ahead, placing himself between blade and sapling, his chest heaving. He said, "Then take me first." The dozer lurched closer, engines screaming in fury. Sparks lit the night, and the ground quaked beneath their feet. The fox howled, her voice carrying like a warning bell across the basin. Edward's hand clenched around a fallen branch like a weapon, knuckles white with resolve. The line between man and machine blurred under smoke and fire. The hillside split with a roar as a massive oak stump tore loose and rolled toward the machines. Edward shouted, "Down!" Metal screamed as the bulldozer lurched sideways, pinned beneath the fallen trunk. Briggs tumbled from the cab, scrambling across mud, his face pale with shock. Clara said, "The forest is striking back with what remains." Matthew pulled her aside just as a wall of mud poured across the path. He said, "This is no place for pride, it buries us all." The fox leapt high onto a rock, her kits clinging behind her. Sparks ignited dry bark, flames snapping to life in the chaos. Edward lifted Clara by the arm, both staggering into the dark smoke. Nature itself had joined the battle, relentless and merciless. The fire roared higher, flames dancing on water and smoke, like devils unchained. Clara said, "If we stay, we burn with it." Edward's gaze fixed on the sapling, its leaves trembling but still green in the inferno's glow. He said, "We take it, or all is lost." Matthew bent low, coughing blood, but his hand pressed firmly to Edward's arm. He said, "Carry it forward, no matter what happens to me." Briggs staggered, dirt-streaked, shouting, "You'll die for nothing!" But his words were drowned by the howl of collapsing earth. Clara cradled the sapling in her arms, clutching it like a child. She said, "Then let it be worth everything." The climax pressed down with heat and finality. The final collapse thundered as ridge, fire, and flood collided in one merciless crescendo. Edward dragged Clara uphill, sapling tight in her arms, while Matthew stumbled behind. He said, "Go, don't wait for me." Clara cried, "We stand together." The ground tore open, swallowing machines, stumps, and Briggs' shouts into the churning abyss. The fox bounded past them, kits at her side, leaping into safety with desperate grace. Edward pulled Clara onto solid rock just as the flood swept below, carrying everything into black fire. Matthew fell to his knees, chest rattling, but a smile broke through soot-streaked lines. He said, "The forest will live in you now." His voice faded as silence swallowed the flames. The climax left nothing unchanged. Dawn arrived thin and gray, a tired light crawling over the drowned basin. Clara said, "The night took much, but something still breathes here." Edward eased her onto a rock, the sapling cradled between them like a fragile flame. He said, "It lived through the worst we could imagine." Matthew sat apart, breath ragged, eyes on the slow water that had become a mirror. He said, "This land will remember who stood and who fled." Mist lifted, revealing a new map of pools and channels stitched by chance. Clara said, "The forest is gone, yet its pulse has changed shape, not stopped." A heron drifted low, legs trailing, testing the newborn marsh with careful grace. Edward said, "If we keep guard, roots will write a different future." The wind moved softly, and for once, it did not carry fire. Silence settled into something gentler, the kind that invites breath instead of stealing it. Clara said, "We cannot rebuild what was, but we can tend what is." Edward gathered drifted mulch, laying a cradle of soil around the sapling's shaken roots. He said, "Shelter first, then waiting." Matthew pressed a palm to his ribs, but his voice carried a steady thread. He said, "Fence the edges with stone, keep the runoff from scouring it again." The fox watched from reeds, kits nestled close, eyes bright with wary trust. Clara said, "We share this refuge now, all of us or none of us." The sun lifted higher, turning puddles to coins of light. Edward said, "Let's mark a line no blade can cross." The new day held, delicate but real. They worked in measured silence, hands black with silt, thoughts clean with purpose. Clara said, "This is penance, and it is promise." Edward anchored a driftwood stake, tying cloth strips that fluttered like pale leaves. He said, "These markers speak when we are gone." Matthew traced channels with his boot, guiding water away from tender roots. He said, "Make it slow, and the land will keep it." A breeze carried the faintest sweetness of new growth beneath the ash. Clara said, "Even grief can feed a seed if we let it." A distant engine coughed, then faded, leaving only frogs and the rustle of reeds. Edward said, "We are not the first caretakers, just the latest to try." The earth accepted the shape of their resolve. By afternoon, clouds thinned, and the marsh brightened like a wound beginning to scar. Clara said, "I keep hearing their voices, but softer now." Edward crouched, checking the sapling's stem where wind had bruised it. He said, "It holds straight without my hand." Matthew's cough faded to a whisper, and a small smile settled beneath his weariness. He said, "Strength returns in inches, not miles." A dragonfly hovered, jeweled against the pale sky, as if testing the air for welcome. Clara said, "Let beauty make its claim again." The heron stepped nearer, bold with curiosity, staking its quiet sovereignty. Edward said, "If water stays, life stitches fast." The place no longer felt like an ending, but a threshold. Shadows lengthened without menace, sliding over water that now knew its paths. Clara said, "We will return, and we will keep returning." Edward set a final marker, a small cairn built with care rather than force. He said, "This is a promise in stone." Matthew rested his hand on the cairn, eyes bright despite the strain. He said, "Let them see patience, not surrender." The fox led her kits along the higher bank, pausing to study the humans and their quiet work. Clara said, "We are neighbors again, if we earn it." The wind combed the reeds, and a thin chorus of insects rose like prayer. Edward said, "What fell is gone, but what stands might outlast us." Night approached with dignity, not fear. Night drew its curtains slowly, stars scattered like embers above the marsh. Clara said, "The sky feels wider without the trees, yet emptier too." Edward placed a hand on the sapling, his voice quiet. He said, "This is the thread that ties us to tomorrow." Matthew sat in the dim glow, his breath shallow but steady, his eyes reflecting constellations. He said, "The forest is written in the stars as much as in soil." The fox and her kits curled beneath reeds, safe at last, their shapes faint in the moon's silver wash. Clara said, "They rest, so must we." Silence lingered, not oppressive but solemn, carrying both grief and promise. Edward whispered, "May this place remember more than what we lost." The marsh breathed quietly, alive with the faint hum of insects and the distant croak of frogs. Clara said, "Even in ruin, the chorus returns." Edward leaned back against a stump, exhaustion etched deep. He said, "The land forgives slower than it heals." Matthew coughed gently, then managed a smile that broke the heaviness. He said, "Forgiveness is survival's language." Fireflies flickered like tiny spirits, weaving through reeds in broken constellations. Clara said, "They look like pieces of the forest still searching for home." Edward closed his eyes, listening to their quiet dance. He said, "Light finds its way even here." The moment rested like a fragile piece. Clouds parted, revealing the moon in full, washing the marsh with pale fire. Clara said, "The world feels both broken and infinite tonight." Edward held the sapling upright, its leaves trembling in the night breeze. He said, "This one holds the weight of all that fell." Matthew's voice softened to a whisper. He said, "If it grows, so does memory." Thups lifted her head, ears twitching as if she too listened to their words. Clara said, "We are bound to this place now." The wind swept through roots, creating a sound like whispers of the old forest still speaking. Edward said, "The echoes will outlast us all." The night deepened, carrying the memory of fire into silence. Clara said, "When people ask, we must tell not only of loss but of what still breathes." Edward nodded, his gaze on the sapling's fragile crown. He said, "This is testimony carved in green, not in ash." Matthew leaned forward, voice trembling but resolute. He said, "We guard this not for ourselves, but for those who will never know what once stood." The fox shifted, kits pressing close, embodying survival's quiet truth. Clara whispered, "They live because we stayed." The air cooled, filled with the scent of damp earth rather than smoke. Edward said, "This night seals the vow." The first cry of dawn cut across silence, a single bird piercing the night. Clara said, "It begins again even here." Edward lifted his face to the faint light rising in the east. He said, "The forest is gone, but not its echo." Matthew's voice carried one last time, fragile yet unyielding. He said, "Echoes shape the future when memory holds them true." The fox rose, leading her kits into the grass, their tails brushing the mist like whispers fading. Clara pressed her palm to the sapling, her tears falling onto its leaves. She said, "You are the last word, and the first hope." The light swelled, gold against the ashes, carrying the echo forward.